Fantastic panel joining us here in studio. Doug, it's great to see you and have you back on the program. How have you been?
Good. Great to be back on with you.
Covered well from the whole hurricane, right?
Yes,
Were you here this
God.
weekend?
Yeah, I was in New York City.
Okay,
yeah.
Perfect. And also we have Dan Schorr joining us here, Inspector General from Yonkers, New York, and former criminal prosecutor, right?
Right.
So a regular on the program. And of course, Doug is very familiar to the Fox News audiences and is a former federal prosecutor. And Jeff King joining us, criminal defense attorney out of the Dallas Bureau. Thanks for being with us today, Jeff. So gentlemen, we have a number of topics to discuss, and I know, Doug, one in particular that you find particularly intriguing is the forced testing, required drug testing of poor people. Tell us about that.
Well, I think it's an interesting issue because I think you start with sort of a political soundbite. Now, this is a great idea. We don't want people on welfare, using government money to feed their drug habits. And I agree with that, by the way, obviously. But I looked at a couple of references to statistical reports, and they were kind of interesting. They said there's no distinction, Dan, for example, between those who work and those who don't work in terms of drug use. They said something like 70% of those who use illegal drugs are employed. And then the other thing that struck me that was kind of interesting is that the cost, if you just use sort of ninth grade math, they were saying, if they test 1,000 people and 5 come up, it actually costs more to test than to pull the benefits. So to give it from 30,000 feet, while it sounds like rhetorically a good idea, I don't think practically it's a good idea.
And it costs them more because they have to pay for the test, which, they're already poor to begin with. They can't afford the test, let alone. So.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're not going to save money doing this, but on the other hand, when we're giving benefits to someone, it irks us as society when people are using some of that for drugs. I think a good compromise would be if you test positive for drugs once, you have to get some kind of counseling treatment to stay on the welfare. And then if you test positive a second time or you don't do your treatment, then you're denied benefits.
Well, that makes sense.
I agree. Do a compromise. The other thing, of course, that's so interesting, if you morph into the legal arena of it, is that the courts have said that it is a Fourth Amendment search and it's a little bit unreasonable. Of course, there are exceptions, obviously, in that it's like train and bus operators. Of course.
All right, let's get Jeff's thoughts on this. Jeff, does this sound like a reasonable idea? Because one of the caveats is if they test positive, then you are denied welfare benefits for a year until you retest and you test clean.
Well, I agree with the other two gentlemen. First of all, practically speaking, it sounds like a great idea in theory. And it's just one of those things you hear on the news, and everyone will automatically agree with it. But the problem is, outside of the obvious Fourth Amendment issues you're going to have with this, and I think it won't take long before it actually sees the inside of a courtroom, I just think the money could be used a lot smarter. I mean, these things, it's going to cost a lot of money to test these people. And being a former military person myself, I've been part of this testing process. But the difference is it was random. You never really know when you were going to get tested. Here, it's almost a scheduled testing. And the bottom line is people are going to find a way around that.
Yes, I saw that on an episode of Entourage. Did you see that?
That's exactly what I thought.
I'm still traumatized by it, where he puts on the fake whatever.
It's a lot more creative.
Yeah, I mean, but now are people going to be like, I need to get one of those, right? That was pretty funny. But this is interesting because this has some different areas that it can be carried over to, because in July, Indiana adopted a drug test for participants in a state job training program.
Right, I saw that.
Yeah, and an Ohio State Senator also, Tim Grandel, recently said he plans to introduce a bill to require the unemployed to take a drug test before they're actually able to receive unemployment benefits, Dan.
I think one of the points of these programs is to help people get on their feet, so they're not going to be on the programs for a long time. So part of the theory would be, if we're going to help you, we want to make sure that you're doing your part to clean up your life and that you're really taking the steps to try to be successful. It's, as we talked about before, it's not really going to be a money saver.
But it's so ironic because it's like a circular scenario, because the point is, theoretically, if you took somebody who had a drug problem into, let's say, a training program, then they could get off of drugs. You can argue the reverse. So it's tricky. I mean, I don't have a strong opinion, honestly. There are arguments in both directions, but I think that when you look at the studies that show that the costs are high and that it's not necessarily productive, I think, as the other guests said, and I mean, some kind of compromise would be good.
Exactly. All right, I'm going to move on to another story that we're going to cover. It was in the Washington Post, an article about the federal judge temporarily blocking the enforcement of the Alabama law. Doug, take us through that.
I knew that was going to happen, seriously.
You called it.
Well, not that I'm such a rocket scientist, honestly, but I mean, the point is you didn't have to be a rocket scientist because the law was supposed to go into effect September 1st. And here's this big hearing on a very complicated question. So, of course, the judge is going to turn around and basically stay her decision and say, I'll decide it, I think she said September 28th, et cetera. Now, to walk through it real quick, and then I'll let the other guys weigh in. I mean, this is a preemption question. In other words, the federal government says that immigration is an area of federal law only. Right. And there's two types of preemption. One is conflict, where a state law conflicts with federal law. Yonkers could not pass a law that says that Yonkers residents don't have to pay federal income taxes, obviously, because it directly conflicts with federal law. But then you also have field preemption, and that one means the whole field is occupied. I think it's a split of the baby, and I think that just like in the other venues, Arizona, the judge may uphold parts and strike parts.
Right, other similar state laws have been modified by federal courts. It's interesting because, as you said, this judge didn't rule on the merits, but both sides are kind of claiming partial victory, saying, well, it wasn't thrown out on one side.
She needs more time to rule on it, is what she's saying, Jeff, which seems to be reasonable because part of the problem is you even have the local officials that are supposed to train the police officers, et cetera, as to exactly what their additional duties and obligations on the job in the field would be. And he said, I really don't know what to tell him because some of it's pretty confusing. So how are you supposed to enforce the law? People really aren't clear exactly all the tenets of it. And interestingly enough, Alabama, supposedly this law is one of the most stringent, even more stringent than what Arizona tried to put through.
And I think what you're going to have, what I see is the most dangerous part of laws like these is that it's going to end up profiling people. And you're going to have people that are authorized to be here, whether they're visitors or resident aliens, that are going to be detained for long periods of time while they figure out what their status is. But I like that this debate is ongoing because it's just going to keep rotating from state to state. And it's the state government saying, hey, federal government, if you're not going to enforce this to something that's satisfactory to us, we're going to pass our own laws. So I think it's healthy that it's going on. I like that, I don't know if I like it, but I think it's interesting that this law in Alabama is actually, at least part of it seems to be focusing on the other people that, quote, benefit from illegal immigration, and that's the employers of these people.
Right. Well, that's another aspect of it. All right, let's move on to USA Today article. Polygamous leader Warren Jeffs' critical condition after refusing food. He went on this kind of like hunger strike. Apparently, he became very ill. He's been removed, I guess, to a hospital facility. But I guess he's critical but stable.
Right. He was in medically induced coma at one point. He's, of course, the 55-year-old cult leader who had wives of 12 and 15 years old. He's a sex abuse defendant who was convicted. He's going to be eligible for parole at age 100. So he should, if he doesn't die from starvation, he will live the rest of his life in prison.
Well, if he doesn't expire prematurely due to another situation.
I was a prosecutor in the Sex Crimes Bureau. I was a prosecutor in the Sex Crimes Bureau, and the victims here, they're traumatized for life.
Yes.
Be passed on to the next generation. So,
well, he also apparently tried to hang himself. I don't know if you saw that 4 or 5 years ago while awaiting trial.
Look, there's a lot
I didn't know more about that.
There's a lot of tragedies in the news. Him starving himself is not one of them.
No, I agree with you.
He's a terrible person, but
no, I agree.
It's an interesting issue about what the authorities have to do to keep him
That's
alive.
what I was just going to say.
Right.
What are they required to do?
They have a medically induced coma. They're trying to preserve him, which is interesting because they try to save his life, but at the same time, he wants to die. And he's in
but you make a great point because
and you know how much money that costs us to try and
But it's so interesting,
bring
the ethics of that. Here's this, horrific person who not only is horrific but's been convicted of all the crimes, and then he does this, self-inflicted wound of not eating, goes in a coma, and they're actually ethically required to save him.
I know. Okay, Jeff, let's get your thoughts on Warren Jeffs.
Well, I know that people that are facing life imprisonment, particularly in the first couple weeks, it's not, unfortunately, that uncommon for somebody to try to hurt themselves or just end it all. I think it's the way he's doing it as far as starving himself, and I guess at one point, and I don't know if it was this time or the last time, he was actually banging his head against the wall to try to hurt himself. He's got a lot more going on in his head with his mixed up views on the world and his religion, I think, that's contributing to this. But it's not that uncommon for folks that are facing the rest of their life in prison to try to do something like this to themselves.
Yeah, I think he just doesn't want to deal with the consequences of his actions because the guy clearly is some kind of sociopath and narcissist with his behavior. We heard the tapes. He's got the tapes where he's telling a 14 and a 12-year-old, if you this is how you can sexually please me, and if you do this, you're going to be pleasing God. This guy's the worst kind of just monster. But they are saying, you bring up a great point, Jeff, that his problems aren't just due to dehydration and not taking in enough fluids and food. There's some other kind of mental problem or issue there that they're also trying to deal with. All right, well, we're going to have to go to a commercial break, but before we do, I want to direct your attention to today's FoxNews.com live You Decide poll for Tuesday, August 30th. Should adults applying for government assistance be required to undergo a drug screening? This is the top story that we were talking about today at the beginning of the program. Your choices are yes, many people abuse the system, no, it's an invasion of privacy, or you can say not sure. Our panel kind of came down in the middle of a compromise situation, and we do want to thank you for taking part in yesterday's poll. Final tally had responses from 24 countries and 49 states. And last but not least, don't forget you can take Fox with you. Wouldn't you want to take us with you everywhere you go? You can have our free iPad application on foxnews.com, and you can even get it on your phone. This is pretty exciting. foxnews.com/mobile or on Twitter at Fox News Live. I think I've covered all the bases for the social media enthusiasts out there. Quick commercial break, right back after these messages. Stay with us.